I will be presenting some of the work that we do at the Javeriana University, inspired by all the work that Dr. Matallana has made, and another mentor that is Professor Ibanez, and other people in the Latin American Network of Studies of Social Cognition. And I want to assume or take that position of the question that I shared with you yesterday, and it's actually we who try to do things in social neuroscience. What can we contribute to you that are trying to generate some transformation scenarios with the communities, scenarios that promote pro-sociality, cooperation? The findings that we have, many of them are not directly talking about those scenarios that you work, but I think that they can have a good dialogue and can generate some insights about how implementing these findings in the work that you do. Now, can I share the screen? Can we see the presentation or not? Okay, basically, we who work in social neuroscience models, we could say that there are three large groups of studies in social neuroscience. One of them are the studies that try to understand what are the basic mechanisms of understanding emotional or social science, and and this if you want to generate a cooperation scenarios, it's key that initially one can determine what are the processes in the most immediate effect of social effects, and this has an important aspect because many times the decisions about whether to cooperate or not are determined by factors that you yourself have described in other presentations by bias, and biases sometimes are not determined by these high reflections. So these people did this in the past, another person, so now I cannot trust. But many times it's automated, and they come from implications of perceiving emotional and social sciences in the others. And the second is that there is a large group of studies that we could say that are more reflective. The first that I mentioned are much more automated, but the others are much more reflexive. They require cognitive effort. And one of the processes that I think is central to generate prosociality scenarios, that is the famous perspective taking process. Some of them called in theory of mind. I am a little contrary to those notions of a theory of mind, and I might sound a little heretical because this is based on some of my mentors. They have made me see how what is behind is not a theory. It's not that you're generating theory about what the other does and the other things, but that there are imaginations about the others in a very automated manner. But what is true is that the process over there is just taking the perspective of other, imagining what somebody is feeling who crossed the border between Mexico and the United States, and there is a military agent who told them stop. And you can say, poor guy, he's gonna have a bad time, and I don't need to be Mexican crossing the border or Colombian crossing that border. I can be here and I can barely imagine that. That kind of processes are highly studied in the social neuroscience model. Finally, there are some approaches to the study about what allows to have that pro-social behavior and cooperation, and some of those studies I want to share, probably some reflections that can contribute. Some of the studies that I think that are central or key are those who try to determine the factors that promote empathy. What module empathy? And in empathy, here always in Colombia, for those who are not Colombian, have always said that if we are more empathetic, we will do better. And I think that a part of doing better is having empathy, of course, but it's not the only thing, and probably is not the most important. Some of the findings in empathy show, for example, that indeed there are some neural networks, highly published in English. These networks had a large development, and is the issue of a pain network and networks associated, the pain network. They seem to be active. like the insula, that help to determine corporal changes are focused on perceiving their own pain, but curiously enough, when you see the other go through a pain, they activate. This is the famous pain network published in the Science. Tanya Singer. Then she had a lot of problems for bullying her students, but she made a large contribution to the paradoxes of these studies. But she made a great contribution of this that is called the network of shared pain. And there are many studies that try to manipulate situations. Here's a study published by my colleague and friend Sandra Weiss, professor in Los Andes University. We have worked with her for many years, and we do this work of empathy through pain and try to see the capacity that people have to realize what happens if something is intentional or something is accidental, and evaluating if they have the feelings about what happens to the other or not, and if they have a cognitive judgments or about the one executing the actions. Will they punish the one who committed the action? Will they give some kind of punishment, reprimand, or not? So these kind of evidence has contributed a lot to the contribution of what are the neural substrata of empathy. Curiously enough, studies in this uh, have shown that having more empathy is not having more prosociality, and this is a key element that I wanted to share with you. Networks of prosociality, here plotted in red. This is also a contribution of Professor Singer and Benjamin, who have tried to elucidate differential neural patterns between having this empathetic response associated to perception of pain, that is here, the insula, and the anterior cortex, singular cortex, more associated to having prosocial behaviors or having altruisms, are different. And here, this is a key element. This network seems to imply, or at least with structures implied in motor behavior, motivation, and reward. So having a prosocial behavior doesn't seem to be the same as having those empathetic modulations. At least they are related. And there is another finding that I find that is a key, and it's the reaction that people have when they see this kind of a stimulus. Somebody who in the morning is begging for money. Some people have the capacity of making this quick social inference and saying it's somebody who is suffering. I think that I have some resources that person doesn't have. I go through that emotional significance of what's going through in all that process, like quite cognitively, and I do actions to promote help. Other people, in face of the same stimuli, could be recruited emotionally in base of what they are observing. They could be a trap of the emotional charge of seeing somebody suffer, and they could have something that is called affective sharing that is quite hard, that generates very high personal stress. And personal stress, what it does is, no, 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 I will go, I can't, or just they avoid going to where they see these kind of people, or the effect of what just happened, the massacre in Salado. Okay, let's change the channel and see the soap opera. What happened in this country for a lot of time. This is many findings to suggest that all the stages of empathy are not necessarily related to prosociality. Another finding I think that are important, including in these studies of prosociality and promotion of reconciliation and forgiveness, are the studies that try to show this. This study, the classic ones, have shown that the agent normally perceives emotions in the faces. You probably have seen there are some classic studies of Professor Paul Ekman, many studies. Um, the Professor Matallana has led some of those studies, and I know that other colleagues have tried about how you perceive. Uh, what you know is that you can extract quick emotions and quickly in faces. Can extract a basic and complex emotion. And note that there are high cross-cultural or intercultural evidence of that capacity. The thing is that not only the faces, and I think that is a key element. There is a lot of science, but corporal signs that are transmitted emotions. We have made some of those studies manipulating the emotions in the faces and those emotions in the bodies. And sometimes we make them match, like generating a face of fear in a body of a fear, but other times what we do is we generate some incongruent items, face of fear with this position of disgust, and we expect it to be more difficult to integrate the situations of disparity amongst the emotions body face, but what we realize is that that happens differentially about those who are processing the or acting the stimuli. So in this study, adolescents who have committed some violence against others are unable, it's very hard for them, or they have less that the controls to perceive the emotions coming from the face. In a way, they seem to be biased, so that it has an explanation. They are people who are willing to come back to continued physical exchange, and they will be recruiting much more the body interaction because it could have adaptive behavior. So that is integrated in certain areas, networks highly related to emotional perception. But if you wanted to capture where you are integrating the emotions in terms of the body brains, in some circuits in processing, sensory, motor, and that's a key because in a way the emotional component is generating like that capacity. It would be supporting the capacity to perceive sensorial and motor statuses that you see in other people. So another point along the same line, the prior point, it's let's look at the emotions, let's look at perception of social signs, but not only in others. So other kind of emotional burden. Then there are some secondary, tertiary emotions that are complex that we could call social or moral emotions. We in this group we have a work in some emotions, uh, many more. And you can talk to people, psychology professors that probably have a lot more background in this kind of approach. They know that there is this repertoire of secondary, tertiary emotions, and some others that could be central for that interaction are those related to emotions that we call based on the other's fortune and emotions like of self-awareness. These emotions, I bring them here because they have extremely high social value. There are others that could not be so explicitly social, like pride, but here there are others that are clearly social. If you are jealous, usually you are jealous of someone, and if you enjoy others um, suffering, in a way you are suffering or you are enjoying the suffering of other people. The famous stadium effect, the feeling that we have had of gaining a soccer game to Argentina, see them cry and see the winner clap, is part of the national history. Is it reminds that emotion that everybody at a certain level have. One thing is that we laugh with the Argentinian friend of laughing that we won 5-0. But another thing is that we see the Argentinian friend falling down and fractured and laugh. So there is a level of how this is expressed. There are some processes, some neural arousals that are quite associated to these emotions that are called the self-awareness, that are those that would help to promote prosociality. They give a shame that would allow to have this regulation of this pro-social behavior, or would give the feeling of guilt, blame, that I have done something amongst others, and those emotions could help promote that scenario. So if we want to see these scenarios of cooperation, altruism, it's worth studying. This emotional integration, not only from classic basic emotions, but also emotions with a social and moral component. We have done this by manipulating different conditions of jealousy, morality in envy, deservedness in envy, and we have tried to track these neural correlations associated to those integrations in regular models and in pathological models. Me, personally, I am a psychiatrist, and our entire group uses the models of elation to try to understand this kind of change. But basically, what I wanted to share It's this invitation to study emotions with social and moral component. The next part is you have to pay attention to these kind of studies that are the studies that try to assess the behaviors that you have towards people that you consider your own group and to the out group. And in that scenario, there's a lot of biases highly described by professionals like the famous rejection to the one that seems different, and the empathy towards the closer ones. Like all the behavior we as Colombians, classically migrants, and the behavior we have had with the Venezuelan migration or with the large internal force displacement, one of the highest around the world in terms of internal displacement in Syria. So this kind of biases is worth to study them continuously, and it is a bias that is key. It's not only the bias of the outgroup derogation, it's not only the bias of I see somebody that I think is not in my group and I reject that person or I don't allow for integration is the bias. It's the bias of choosing systematically the one that I find similar, and that bias is much harder to capture because you are immersed. You are there. You can see yourself less frequently in scenarios of exclusion, but you are less aware in the scenarios of inequality and exclusion, and there is an issue. The studies in these fields of prosociality would have to see much more all the development on the studies of membership and the favoritism in group. So, in something of this, we did checking the behavior of children in school stages, manipulating the notion of stadium and fans with some puppets, with T-shirts, trying to represent belonging to the group. Argentina, Colombia T-shirts. We did in Colombia, Argentina, and Chile, and we handled a little bit scenarios of group belonging versus moral or immoral actions. So the puppets, like in a way, and the children pay with the puppets. They saw the puppets, and there were some agents that we invented. There were agents that helped the puppet, or that attacked him. So the attack was quite simple. They would make fan out of them. So basically, there was a puppet that was like the bad puppet, who would do bad things against the out group or against the in group. Then we asked the children to assess which of the puppets would help or attack the other, which one would they prefer. And basically, children have systematic responses of preferring the puppet who was helpful. And this idea of making fun or attacking the other one who is different from us, well, we didn't find in this age, but we found is that we had them like in this economic dictator game of sharing resources to the puppets, to the one who had done good things and bad things, and they gave a little bit more candy to the puppet who helped the Colombian to in-group. So we were finding this effect, not the out-group derogation, but the in-group favoritism. That is one of the effects that I invite to review in these studies. Another thing that I find key, I'm going fast. One thing that is key, I will go here very fast about some of the studies. Basically, realizing here there is this field that is good about research about the origins of the prosocial behaviors. Is all the cognition in babies, cognition in children in early stages, because they allow to reveal some behaviors that at least seem more automated, at least before the children go to school, where it's assumed that there is this large effect of education and the effect that the school has in normalizing behaviors. But the studies in babies, for example, about the fact that this is something mentioned, studies that show that in babies we don't entirely see a behavior that suggests that we are always looking for personal benefit. Some of these studies, like this classic of Hamlin and Well, where they see that the children, one of the interesting techniques in studying with kids are this measure of time of gaze. They have children observing things, and generally kids see much more situations that they find as new, strange. children from 6 months, they see more exclusion than inclusion situations. So it's like the inclusion, I know, so the exclusions, like what happened there, is something strange. So studies in babies are important to reveal these automated behaviors that suggest that there are some trends to prefer cooperation. So in this case, they enjoyed much more, or at least they had this behavior to prefer this agent, the triangle, that helped the circle versus the square that seemed to be the agent that was like not so cooperating. Okay, a final thing that I wanted to say about this. This notion has to do with some of the recent studies where we have been involving, and it's this one. Is this a notion? And it's, I think that is necessary to the extent that that's possible. Start to study cases that are not always the cases that have issues, but some of the scenarios that seem to suggest that there's certain hope or that there are opportunities for reconciliation. This is just an image that I took here in the Econonso ETSR with Professor Matallana and Professor Kankowski a few months ago, and we saw a group of former guerrilla members in the process of reincorporation who were working with in weaving in this small business that they created. And I said there's something there, it's different. These people, they accepted this process and they have been here for a while, and another kind of people in the same group abandoned this alternative. So this kind of opportunities could be a good idea to study reconciliation scenarios. We did these models assessing machine learning processes, assessing other factors to see what were the best behaviors of predictors of behaviors like that. And we found something very interesting. On the one hand, that all the factors of the contextual factors, all of this based on a larger survey promoted by ARN about social and psychological factors in former combatants, a little bit to capture psychological risks of this population. More than 26,000 former combatants, probably you know this database, and what we found interesting is that the social factors in general had a lot much more weight than the psychological scenarios of resiliences. Much more when you use machine learning. And something that we find very interesting, one of the factors that weigh the most are the membership factors. This I find interesting because paradoxically in a similar study with machine learning we have shown that membership was also quite associated to having more violent behaviors. Membership seemed quite connected to this of being in group or out group. It seems to be a determinant factor for any social outcome, the pro-social or anti-social. And a little bit it talks about this organizing principle of behavior of our species that seems to be more like a bring gregarious than those scenarios of obtaining a personal benefit or social benefit. It seems to be more this gregarism for that thing that you're saying, the good, the bad, what is more important. So here with this, I'm gonna close, and I want to say to this that has allowed for this conversation to occur. Thank you very much.